So, welcome back. This is the second part of the Silver Key, and I'm sorry I didn't record it yesterday. It was a lot to take in. I'll admit it's a little bit confusing, but I'm going to go on and get right into it because I don't know how long it's going to be. It's going to be at least 30 minutes. I know that, but we shall see. It's a little hard to follow till the end, and then everything makes sense. Starting up where I left off yesterday, or not yesterday, a couple days ago. An old servant forced a carven lid, shaking as he did so at the hideous faces leering from the blackened wood, and at some unplaced familiarity. Inside, wrapped in a discolored parchment, was a huge key of tarnished silver, covered with cryptical arabesques. But of any legible explanation there was none. The parchment was voluminous and held only the strange hieroglyphs of an unknown tongue, written with an antique reed. Carter recognized the characters as those he had seen on a certain papyrus scroll belonging to that terrible scholar of the South, who had vanished one midnight in a nameless cemetery. The man had always shivered when he read this scroll, and Carter shivered now. But he cleaned the key and kept it by him nightly in its aromatic box of ancient oak. His dreams were meanwhile increasing in vividness, and though showing him none of the strange cities and incredible gardens of the old days, were assuming a definite cast whose purpose could not be mistaken. They were calling him back along the years, and with the mingled wills of his fathers were pulling him toward some hidden and ancestral source. Then he knew he must go into the past and merge himself with old things. And day after day he thought of the hills to the north where haunted Arkham and the rushing Miskatonic and the lonely rustic homestead of his people lay. In the brooding fire of autumn, Carter took to the old remembered way past graceful lines of rolling hill and stone walled meadow, distant vale and hanging woodland, curving road and nestling farmstead, and the crystal windings of the Miskatonic, crossed here and there by rustic bridges of stone or wood. At one bend, he saw the group of giant elms, among which an ancestor had oddly vanished a century and a half before, and shuddered as the wind blew meaningly through them. Then there was the crumbling farmhouse of old Goody Fowler, the witch, with its evil little windows and great roof sloping nearly to the ground on the north side. He speeded up his car as he passed it, and did not slacken till he had mounted the hill where his mother and her fathers before her were born, and where the old white house still looked proudly across the road at the breathlessly lovely panorama of rocky slope and verdant valley, with the distant spires of Kingsport on the horizon, and hints of the archaic, dream laden sea in the farthest background. Then came the steeper slope that held the old Carter place he had not seen in over 40 years. Afternoon was far gone when he reached the foot, and at the bend, halfway up, he paused to scan the outspread countryside, golden and glorified in the slanting floods of magic poured out by the western sun. All the strangeness and expectancy of his recent dreams seemed present in this hushed and unearthly landscape, and he thought of the unknown solitudes of other planets as his eyes traced out the velvet and deserted lawns shining undulant between their tumbled walls, the clumps of fairy forests sitting off far lines of purple hills beyond hills, and the spectral wooded valley dipping down in the shadow to dank hollows, where trickling waters crooned and gurgled among swollen and distorted roots. Something made him feel that motors did not belong in the realm he was seeking, so he left his car at the edge of the forest, and putting the great key in his coat pocket, walked on up the hill. Woods now engulfed him utterly, though he knew the house was on a high knoll that cleared the trees except to the north. He wondered how it would look, for it had been left vacant and unattended through his neglect since the death of his strange great uncle Christopher 30 years before. In his boyhood, he had reveled through long oh, visits there, and had found weird marvels in the woods beyond the orchard. Shadows thickened around him, for the night was near. Once a gap in the trees opened up to the right, so that he saw off across leagues of twilight meadow and spied the old congregational steeple on Central Hill in Kingsport, pink with the last flush of the day. The panes of the little round windows blazing with reflected fire. Then, when he was in deep shadows again, he recalled with a start that the glimpse must have come from childish memory alone, since the old white church had long been torn down to make room for the Congregational Hospital. He had read of it with interest, for the paper had told about some strange burrows or passages found in the rocky hill beneath. Through his vuzzle, Through his puzzlement, a voice piped, and he started again at its familiarity after long years. Old Ben Corey had been his Uncle Christopher's hired man, and was aged even in those far off times of his boyhood visits. Now he must be well over 100, but that piping voice came from no one else. Oh, oops. But that piping voice could come from no one else. He could distinguish no words, yet the tone was haunting and unmistakable. To think that old Benny, that's spelled weird. Oh well. To think that old Benny should still be alive. Mr. Randy? Mr. Randy! Whar be ye? Do ye want to scare ye Aunt Marthy's plumb to death? Thought she'd told ye to keep nigh this place in the afternoon and get back after dark. Randy! Randy! He's the beatin'est boy for running off in the woods I ever seen. Half the time a settin' moanin' around the snake den in the upper timber lot. Hey you! Randy! Randolph Carter stopped in the pitch darkness and rubbed his hand across his eyes. Something was queer. He had been somewhere he ought not to be, had strayed very far away to places where he had not belonged, and was now inexhaustibly late. He had not noticed the time on the Kingsport steeple, though he could easily have made it out with his pocket telescope. But he knew in his lateness was something very strange and unprecedented. He was not sure he had his little telescope with him, and put his hand in his blouse pocket to see. Nope, it was not there. But there was the big silver key he had found in a box somewhere. Uncle Chris had told him something odd once about an old unopened box with a key in it, but Aunt Martha had stopped the story abruptly, saying it was no kind of thing to tell a child whose head was already full of queer fancies. He tried to recall just where he had found the key, but something seemed very confused. He guessed it was in the attic at the home in Boston, and dimly remembered bribing Parks with half his week's allowance to help him open the box and keep quiet about it. But when he remembered this, the face of Parks came up very strangely, as if the wrinkles of long years had fallen upon the brisk little cockney. "Randy! Randy! Hey, hey! Randy!" A swaying lantern came around the black bend, and old Benny pounced on the silent and bewildered form of the pilgrim. "Darn ye, boy, so thar ye be! Ain't ye got a tongue in your head that ye can't answer a body? I been a callin' this half an hour, and ye must a heard me a long ago. Don't ye know your Aunt Marthy's all affrighted over ye being off after dark? Wait till I tell ye Uncle Chris when he gets home. Ye'd oughta notta oops. Ye'd oughta know that these here woods ain't no fittin' place to be traipsin' these hour. They's a things abroad what don't do no good for nobody, as my grandison knowed afore me. Come, Mr. Randy, or Hannah won't have to keep us supper for long." I'm going with it. I'm so sorry about that. So Randolph Carter was marched up the road where wandering stars glimmered through high autumn boughs, and dogs barked as the yellow light of small paned windows shone out at the farther turn, and the Pleiades twinkled across the open knoll where a great gambrel roof stood black against the dim west. Aunt Martha was in the doorway and did not scold too hard when Benny showed the trunk in. She knew Uncle Chris well enough to expect such things of the Carter blood. Randolph did not show his key, but ate his supper in silence, and protested only when bedtime came. He sometimes dreamed better when awake, and he wanted to use that key. In the morning, Randolph was up early and would have run off to the upper timber lot if Uncle Chris had not caught him and forced him into his chair by the breakfast table. He looked impatiently around the low pitched room with the rag carpet and exposed beams and corner posts, and smiled only when the orchard boughs scratched at the leaded pane windows of the rear. The trees and the hills were close to him and formed the gates of the timeless realm which was his true country. Then, when he was free, he felt in his blouse pocket for the key, and being reassured, skipped off across the orchard to the rise beyond, where the wooded hill climbed against the heights above even a treeless knoll. The floor of the forest was mossy and mysterious, and great lichened roots rose vaguely here and there in dim light like druid monoliths along the swollen and twisted trunks of a sacred grove. Once in his ascent, Randolph crossed a rushing stream, whose falls, a little way off, sang runic incantations to the lurking fauns and Asiapans and dryads. Then he came to the strange cave in the forest slope, the dreaded snake den which country folk shunned, and away from which Benny had warned him again and again. It was deep, far deeper than anyone but Randolph suspected, for the boy had found a fissure in the farthermost black corner that led to a loftier grotto beyond, a haunting sepulchral place whose granite walls held a curious illusions of conscious artifice. On this occasion, he crawled in, as usual, lighting his way with matches flitched from the sitting room match safe, and edging through the final crevice with an eagerness hard to explain, even to himself. He could not tell why he approached the farther wall so confidently, or why he instinctively drew forth the great silver key as he did so. But on he went, and when he danced back to the house that night, he offered no excuses for his lateness, nor heeded in the least the reproofs he gained for ignoring the noontide dinner horn altogether. Ooh, I said some of that backwards, but I'm just going to go with it. It seemed right. Now, it is agreed by all the distant relatives of Randolph Carter that something occurred to heighten his imagination in his 10th year. His cousin, Ernest B. Aspinwall, Esquire of Chicago, is fully 10 years his senior, and distinctly recalls a change in the boy after the autumn of 1883. Randolph had looked on scenes of fantasy that few others could ever have beheld, and stranger still were some of the qualities which he showed in relation to very mundane things. He seemed, in fine, to have picked up an odd gift for prophecy, and reacted unusually to things which, though at the time without meaning, were later found to justify the singular impressions. In subsequent decades, as new inventions, new names, and new events appeared one by one in the book of history, people would now and then recall wonderingly how Carter had years before let fall some careless word or undoubted connection with what was then far in the future. He did not himself understand these words, or know why certain things made him feel certain emotions, but fancied that some unremembered dream must be responsible. It was as early as 1897 that he turned pale when some traveler mentioned the French town of Beloy in Santerre, and friends remembered it when he was nearly mortally wounded there in 1916 while serving with the Foreign Legion in the Great War. Carter's relatives talked much of these things because he was lately disappeared. His little old servant Parks, who for years bore patiently with his vagaries, last saw him on the morning he drove off alone in his car, with a key he had recently found. Parks had helped him get the key from the old box containing it, and had felt strangely affected by the grotesque carvings on the box, and by some other odd quality he could not name. Okay. When Carter left, he had said he was going to visit the old ancestral country around Arkham. This is where it all starts falling together. Give me a sec. Halfway up Elm Mountain, on the way to the ruins of the old Carter place, they found his motor set carefully by the roadside, and in it was a box of fragrant wood, with carvings that frightened the countrymen who stumbled upon it. The box held only a queer parchment whose characters no linguist or paleographer had been able to decipher or identify. Rain had long effaced any possible footprints, though Boston investigators had something to say about evidences of disturbances along the fallen timbers of the Carter place. It was, they averred, as though someone had groped about the ruins at no distant period. A common white handkerchief, found among forest rocks on the hillside beyond, cannot be identified as belonging to the missing man. There is talk of apportioning Randolph Carter's estate among his heirs, but I shall stand firmly against this course because I do not believe that he is dead. There are twists of time and space, of visions and reality, which only a dreamer can divine. And from what I know of Carter, I think he has merely found a way to traverse these mazes. Whether or not he will ever come back, I cannot say. He wanted the lands of dream he had lost, and yearned for the days of his childhood. Then he found a key, and I somehow believe he was able to use it to strange advantage. I shall ask him when I see him, for I expect to meet him shortly in a certain dream city we both used to haunt. It is rumored in Uthar, beyond the river sky, that a new king reigns on the opal throne of Elak Vad, that fabulous town of turrets atop the hollow cliffs of glass overlooking the twilight sea, wherein the bearded and finey Gori built their singular labyrinths. And I believe I know how to interpret this rumor. Certainly, I look forward impatiently to the sight of that great silver key, for in its cryptical arabesques there may stand symbolized all the aims and mysteries of a blindly impersonal cosmos. That was a mouthful, man. Anyway, that's the end of the Silver Key, and I really appreciate everybody for watching. I got a lot of views on the first one. I was really impressed. Uh, I hope we keep that trend going, and thank you so much for being here. I appreciate it. I think I said that twice.